Hey, everybody. Today for you, podcast number 82. Today's podcast is titled, Something is Following You. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of your weekly Limitless Life Network podcast. I'm Dr. Pete Lombardi, and sitting next to me is the lovely Sandy Lombardi.
Hello, everybody.
And we are here to flesh out the limitations that are preventing you from reaching your goals and living the life you were called to lead. And of course, we want to begin with our level of gratitude. Really great feedback once again this week. Couple nice comments. We're glad that we're reaching you and getting some content to you that is meaningful and helpful in life. And we'll just ask that you just pass it along. Like, follow, share, subscribe. You know the things that perpetuate things in the interwebs. So anyway, today we have, we think, another great show with some really great points and help you expand a little bit and grow a bit. So Something is Following You is the title. And Sandy, you want to give the backstory for this?
Sure. Before our trip down to Atlanta, I was given a book by a friend to read. And I'm sure many of you have read it. I had never heard of it, actually. It's Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And it's extremely interesting. It is set in a concentration camps. And it's written by a doctor, a psychologist. And so he's looking at the human mind and consciousness and what impacts the conditions had on some prisoners and not others, and what was like a few of the factors of those who were able to make it through the camps, whether they eventually were released and lived, or perhaps they did die there, but they were able to pursue something greater than the circumstance they were in. And so just a lot of great points that we're going to talk about from the book.
Yeah. And it was a bit challenging to try to put this together in a format that I think is meaningful in the way we do the podcast. But I think we came up with some really good points. So the first one is pursuing success is a myth. And that alone could be the title of point number 2, but it's actually followed up with somewhat of the explanation, and that is success actually ensues. So how would you describe this, Sandy?
Well, it was a point brought up by the author in the foreword of the book, actually, that, if we are pursuing success just for the point of success, we won't achieve that. But that if we're following like a life of high value, a life of high moral standard, perhaps a Christian life, that success and happiness will ensue or chase after us. It will be like the unintentional byproduct. Like we will be happy, we will be successful if we follow perhaps like the written code that's been provided for us.
Yeah. So I love this because it goes back to a very well-known thing that we've talked about on the podcast before, the be, do, have principle, in that the success is the outcome that people see, and they mistakenly think that's what the pursuit is.
Right.
But in reality it's the be, and being in the moment, being surrendering, I guess, would be a word that I'd like to use. Surrendering to the process and realizing that the moral underpinnings, the foundational things that the Bible has very clearly laid out for us, if we could just keep those as the primary focus. It sounds easy, but it's actually a lot more difficult in the world that we live in today because they're constantly being challenged and dismissed as outdated, not current, unimportant, that there's new things that are more progressive and become attractive to people. And that can become their new moral underpinnings, and it leads to destruction, unfortunately. So I think point number one, it's why we titled the podcast this, that something is following you. And something can be, it can be success. It can be happiness and joy and peace and love. That could be following you. But you have to have that moral underpinning, that foundation to build off of.
Yes. Good. And lead, direct.
Yeah. Hey, thanks. And that brings us to point number 2, which is, are you married to the negative outcome? And this comes up very often in our life. We've talked about it under a different heading called failed purpose. And this oftentimes perpetuates itself. And that it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy where we don't meet with success. We have an idea of what we'd love to see, but it doesn't happen. And so therefore we almost surrender to the outcome that's negative, that we weren't hoping for. So then we acquiesce to not trying anymore and not digging deeper and not owning what we're really looking to achieve. And again, it's not a pursuit of trying to achieve success. It's more of like, can you surrender to the person or the human being that it takes to achieve that outcome?
Think of an adult example, but this morning, Grace is an example of a more childish example. She had an art assignment, and I heard you going over it with her, and she just keeps telling herself that she's a terrible artist. She can't draw, and that's the story she believes. And so you were trying to encourage her, and she just had an excuse, didn't she, for
everything. And basically it came down to, well, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. Well, if that's the attitude, there's no fixing that, right? So you can't, when somebody's attitude is it doesn't really matter, it's no big deal, it's not that important, there's no help for that person, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And then that's the thing, is like either the little things matter or they don't. But everything either matters or it doesn't. And to me, even the smallest things, how you do the small things is how you do everything.
Yeah, we talked about that last week.
Yeah, if you do the small things really well, then that translates into everything that is more important to you in life.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, are you married to the negative outcome? Divorce it. Don't become that. All right. That brings us to point number 3, and I think you can talk about this really well because you've described it to me a couple of times. Point number 3 is, we've titled it The Filling of the Vessel.
Right. So this again was from the book, and I'm going to read actually part of it. And here. He gave the example of filling a vessel with gas. And it didn't matter the size of the container. So if you have a container, 2-liter container, fill it with gas, the expansion is going to be the same as if it were a 5-liter gallon. So what he's saying is the amount of suffering is irrelevant. And so I'll read you. He said, "Thus suffering completely fills the human soul and conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is great or little. Therefore, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative." So we were talking, like Pete and I, and it's our perspective, because it's not only the soul, but the mind. And I think that's huge. It's our perspective on things, whether we will allow the suffering to just consume our thoughts, or whether we will allow the suffering to be displaced, I guess, by joy, because there's always happiness that we can bring in if we will allow it to. So it can displace that amount of suffering.
Yeah. And now for a real world example of this, we have a friend that lost a spouse, and he was talking about the suffering and how he felt and everything. But he also said that he felt guilty about having fun.
Yeah.
And that was like, he almost felt like it was important for him to retain all of the suffering
To honor.
to honor his wife. But at the same time, it's okay to allow joy and happiness into the life. It's not that you forget what has happened in the past, but in order to move on, we have to allow things to replace that in the vessel. And the smallest of win, the smallest of joy, the smallest of success, whatever it might be, that can at least allow people in times of suffering to move on and get by and to lead a better life, to live a more meaningful life. And I believe that that's one of the things that he was getting at in these concentration camps, was that they were surrounded. They were bathed in suffering every day. It was just everywhere. And it was the littlest win that allowed people to get to the next day, get to the next moment. And they cherish those things. They cherish those small wins. I mean, you mentioned to me they were walking to another place, and they all thought they were going to a gas chamber, and they were getting there and crossing the bridge, and they saw that there wasn't a chimney. So they were like rejoicing inside and like so happy that there was no way that they were going to be going into being cremated that day.
Right.
And it was like, wow, that's your highlight of the day. Wow. But you know what? It's all of what you're focusing on. You know, that's a win. Why not focus on the win? Or you can choose to wallow in the losses every day.
Right. They had to find, well, he said those who persevered and continued on in the camp had to find a bit of joy in the slightest things, like you've described. And he kept talking about suffering well, and that has just really stuck with me in the last week and a half that I've been reading the book. And that can be from the smallest irritation that I might feel over something that's happened during the day. I mean, it's if you watch for it, you'll throughout the day over and over there'll be disappointment and frustration and all these things, right? And this book is helping me put that in perspective. Like, it's such a minor thing, like, but suffer well, like just handle that situation well and step through it, and and be pleasant and joyful, and it doesn't have to make your mind flip in this negative way.
Yeah, for sure. All right, that was great. That brings us to point number 4, apathy versus inner value. How would you describe this?
He talked about that many prisoners would just become apathetic. So extreme hardship, right? They were starving. They were freezing cold. They had blisters on their feet and forced to walk miles. So they could become very easily, and you would understand, apathetic to the situation. They would just withdraw versus someone who had an inner strength. And the man who writes the book is not necessarily a Christian, but he alludes to, like, if they had strength in an inner being, in a spiritual being. So to me, that's God. So if they had hope in something greater than themselves, a greater purpose, then they didn't fall prey to this just withering, apathetic state.
Yeah, that's really solid. Those who were anchored to God could not have their identity completely stolen. And that's the word there that catches me, is completely stolen. And I think of the hardships that these people endured, and they tried to strip them of everything. But they never could strip them of something that they could not get a hold of. And that's amazing. And now when we put that into practical sense, they were losing their identity. That's what they were making them do, is try to work. Before they were brought in there, they all had an identity. Maybe they were a business owner. Maybe they were
Doctors,
a doctor. Maybe they were a mother of 6 children. Who knows what they were in their previous life to that. But that identity was taken away from them. So did they have another identity that they could anchor to?
Yes.
Right? And those were the people those were the people that could endure and not fall into that apathetic state.
Yeah. And they still had, if they had that identity in Christ, they had love and apathy towards others. And if they didn't, they fell to this like animal type of primitive being where it was just fight for survival and would do anything to protect their own life. And that just became a vicious thing that took place in the camps as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, they lose their moral underpinnings at that point.
Right.
And that's exactly what the captors were trying to create, was this loss of your moral underpinnings.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the last one is choice of action. How would you describe this one?
He's like, we just talked, they could take away everything, right? They could take away your food, your shelter, your
Clothing.
Yeah, everything you felt like you needed, your identity in a sense, right? You were just a number, but they couldn't take away your choice of how you responded to the environment you were in. And that was a huge point that the author was making, is those who would continue to choose the higher road of moral thinking, they would choose to put others before themselves. They are the ones that were able to find joy in little tiny things. And he said every day there was something I could find joy in the camp, but I had to be looking for it and, intentionally, and not just withering in the past. Like he said, some people would just be so hung up on memories of the past that they couldn't accept or grasp anything positive in the current day.
Let alone looking to a future.
Right. And that, yes, you're right. That was huge. He said if they couldn't look to the future, then they had like no drive, no passion, no reason to live for the future. Yeah.
And I know you mentioned that if they thought about just trying to get to the next holiday, that's when a lot of people would perish, because that's all they could see to was, one more month or one more Christmas, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
That one more, whatever it was, not Christmas, but probably Hanukkah, right?
Yeah, most of them.
Yeah. So, it's an inner decision. It's not based on it. Yes, outside influences will influence you. Outside things beyond your control will always influence you, but you still have the ability to make an inner decision. And what we're really trying to impart upon you is that realizing that you have the power of choice all the time. All the time. It's happening every moment of every day. You have a choice of how you can choose to respond.
Yeah, that's the big takeaway, right, Pete? Is that whatever it might be, whether you have a chronic illness that you're facing, perhaps your home is in turmoil,
Money crisis.
Yeah, everyone has probably something that you can think of. We have a choice of how we respond to it, and what is our action going to be,
and where will you direct your focus? Yeah. All right, well, that's all we have for this week's edition of your weekly Limitless Life Network podcast. Be sure to tune in each and every week so you can stay connected, be inspired, and keep moving toward your best life by stripping away your limitations. And we will see you back next week.